Right, okay. I had a PowerPoint. I'd done my 3 slides as Anders asked me, and I thought by the time I got to do the last presentation, and I've got 12 minutes to do this, you're sick of PowerPoint, so I'm not going to do them. Because what I want to talk about is partly what's in the paper that I've written anyway, but actually I want to make the point that what we're talking about here, and the main issue, is about disruption. We've actually got to disrupt the way things happen, to do new things. We can't just, it's been said all the way through, can't just bolt new bits on top of old models, because it doesn't work. It just gets top heavy. It's like, what's that game with the wooden blocks, Jenga, where you build them up and eventually it topples over into a big mess. So I want to talk about a few of the issues involved in disruption, and I thought it's a bit hard to do it on my own, so I brought some friends along. I was going to say this is Toby and Tara, but I don't know who this is, but one of them's missing. Normally you can guarantee these 2 beasts are lying placidly. Anyone know what they are, or what this one is? Any guess?
It's a tapir.
Yes.
I saw that
yes.
on the
do you read? Yeah, it's a Brazilian tapir. It lives in a zoo in Bristol, so I thought we'd go to the zoo for the afternoon. So we'll have a little trip out from Stockholm to a zoo in Bristol in the west of England, and we'll have some tapirs. We'll go and look at some animals. We couldn't have done that without the internet. We would have to get in some form of transport, organise it probably days ahead, think long and hard about what we were going to do, have the kids packed in the back, make the sandwiches, set off, queue, pay money, whatever. Now, if you want to see a tapir, there they are, 24 hours a day, live. It raises an interesting issue about intrusion in our lives as well. Have they actually given permission to be live on the internet? Has anyone asked, is this informed consent? Are we just voyeuristically dropping in on the lives of a large South American animal? There's a capybara floats around here sometimes as well. I don't even know where it comes from. It's not mentioned. Should we know it's there? Should we be seeing this? Now, this raises all sorts of issues when it comes to our relationship with government and governance and citizens online. The technocracy of government has built up these great walls. This is a great metaphor, isn't it? One of the things I talk about when I talk about parliamentary democracy is the building that you use, the chamber and the building of Parliament, as a metaphor for the kind of democracy that you want. Now, if anyone's been in the Houses of Parliament in London, what kind of metaphor is that for democracy? It's not the easiest place to get into. Just down the road here is a little bit better. It's a little bit more accessible, but it's still a big, imposing building that says, we matter, and we matter more than you, because we're in here, we're powerful. And so if I want to engage with you, I've got to kind of get myself psyched up and go in and sort of do it on your terms and be a little bit subservient, because you're government and I'm just a citizen. And it's much less so at local level. It's much more accessible, much more open. But there are still, you know, the great town halls that you see. There's some great ones in the UK, really amazing Victorian buildings that say power and wealth. And they also say control. And we've got to change that technocracy and that language and that politics of power that goes with it. And the internet's a good way of doing that. Not only can we go to the zoo virtually, we can go to Parliament virtually. We can now watch what happens in our council chambers. We can choose to engage. Thing is, I was making a few notes as we went through today, trying to decide which of the things I've written about were worth raising, because a lot of them have already come up. We talked before about looking for similarities and differences. A lot of similarities, but there's some really interesting things. One thing that does come up for me, and I want to really mention, is don't ever assume that a community is homogenous. Chuck mentioned the stress layers between civil society and community and citizens. You know, they're not the same thing. The more you drill down into a community, the more difference you will find, not the more similarity. We can't ever expect to find ubiquitous, homogenous solutions to democracy. Democracy isn't easy. Democracy isn't IKEA. You don't take it home and assemble it and everybody has the same bookcase. It doesn't work that way. But also, and Catherine made this point, Facebook isn't a civic space, but nor is the government Facebook. We've got to look at it from both sides. We've got to look at okay, if I'm going to engage in a relationship with these people, I've got to trust them. Now, in the UK, which is where I've got the data for, but I don't particularly doubt it's greatly different in any country in the developed world, we do not trust politicians. We don't believe that they have our best interests at heart. We don't think they are reliable. So you'd think we want to get involved, wouldn't you? Well, guess what? We don't. Most people do not want to get involved. Less than half of the British population wants to get involved in issues either nationally or locally. The glimmer of hope is more people are likely to get involved locally than they are nationally. So all we can do is start again in some ways and say, well, actually the system we've got isn't necessarily fit for purpose. In the world that we live in now, in a society that is networked and interconnected and internetworked, and I don't mean digitally, I just mean differently networked to the way it was, is faster paced, is used to a news cycle that's been massively compressed, is used to an information cycle that our ancestors, even going back 2 or 3 generations, would just be overwhelmed with in an instant with the amount of information that we see. We see more in a day than they would see in a year or a lifetime even, going back a few generations. Government hasn't changed that much. Government still looks, in many ways, like it did 100 years ago. That metaphor doesn't work. It doesn't match the society that it's supposed to serve. This is why there's a disconnect. So how do we change it? How do we do things differently? Well, if government isn't Facebook and Facebook isn't a civic space, then we've got to create them. We've got to create new civic commons. We've got to create new spaces that are not necessarily owned by government. I don't want government to own the palace. So we need to create these spaces that are owned and trusted. And now that means shared ownership. It means we've got to create partnerships. We've got to create new ways of doing things that isn't us and isn't them, that aren't adversarial. One of the things that I've been looking at in a lot of my work is how we build pathways into collaboration. And a lot of it is through issues. They come out as sparks. Small things come up. Why do you get involved in politics? Why did you become a councillor? Was there one thing or was it a general?
One thing.
One thing, yeah. I was hedging that question very carefully in case you gave me the wrong answer, but I've heard that from so many people, that there was one thing pushed them. Now, we can't increase people's motivation to get involved, but what we can do is bring down the barriers that allow you to engage. And that's the trick. It's to build new spaces that are trusted, to reduce the barriers to that engagement, and we've got to look at the cultural resonance as well. We've got to look at how democracy shapes around the society that we live in. It clearly doesn't at the moment. At the moment, it feels like it's a hard edge that we hit against. How do we make it a soft edge that we work with? So that all requires a lot of changing. It's a whole changing landscape. And I mean, it's really interesting, actually. I still have this conversation with people, and they still don't get it sometimes. Fortunately, it's getting rarer. But I'm sorry, digital is not a choice you're going to make. Let's be really clear about that. I think it's been said a couple of times today, but it's really important. The other thing, though, that I don't think has been said, which I'm going to stop on, is there is no status quo. One of the things we look for in policy or in politics or in civil society is a platform to work from. We don't have it because the disruption that we have at the moment in terms of our society and in terms of technology and the way things are changing and evolving is so rapid, there is no status quo. So we have to maintain that fluidity. We can't just look for... I get really angry when I hear people talk about best practice, because best practice is a way to mediocrity. Good practice, good ideas taken and adapted, but you can't take that idea from there and replicate it there, and there, because it becomes bad practice very quickly. You've got to innovate. You've got to innovate quick, you've got to innovate fast, you've got to fail, you've got to move on, you've got to learn, you've got to bring people in. And so you've got to create new structures. And this is why we've gone to the zoo. We couldn't have done that 10 years ago. Couldn't have done that 5 years ago, really. I mean, considering we're sitting in Stockholm watching tapirs live in Bristol. That takes quite a serious bit of technology. You know, it's funny watching them, but the technology there is quite incredible when we think about it. It's technology that wouldn't have existed for any of us 10 years ago. Just wouldn't have been conceivable. So what can we do in 10 years' time? What can we conceive of doing in 5, 10 years' time that we can't conceive of doing now? And how does democracy get reshaped and made stronger around that? Okay, leave it at that.